Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 400th Years of African American History Museum. We are today recording this session. It's going to be two sessions. We have Renika Montgomery as our facilitator. She will be going through the museum. Please be aware that most of these videos and pictures are very graphic. And we also would like to know that the copyrights of these videos are owned by the African American Museum down in DC, and we have been only approved just to show to education and not to be sold. Okay, and now we're going to start with Ms. Renika.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Cindy said, my name is Renika Montgomery-Tamakloe, and I'm going to be your facilitator. So let's get started with colonization. So for centuries, the African continent had been visited by Europeans. But when the Native American indigenous population in the New World died from overwork, illness, and war, the European colonizers needed a new workforce. The colonizers needed laborers for mining, farming, and many other activities in the New World. So they began kidnapping and importing stolen Africans in what became to be known as the triangular slave trade. But prior to European colonization, what was in Africa? There were many civilizations in Africa, many thriving civilizations on the African continent, such as ancient Kush and the Mali Empire. So Kush, which is in present-day Sudan, ruled over a huge swath of territory along the Nile River, south of Egypt. Ancient Kush was a prosperous nation that traded in ivory, gold, and other precious metals. The Kushites, like the Egyptians, erected pyramids, and Meroe, the ancient capital, has more pyramids than all of Egypt. The Mali Empire in Western Africa came to prominence in the 1200s under the leadership of the Lion King, Sindy R. It was a major trader in Western Africa, and Timbuktu was renowned for its schools. The Mali Empire declined in the 1500s, but at its peak was one of the richest kingdoms in the world. And if you'll see at the bottom of this page, you'll see pictures of the pyramids at Meroe in Sudan and a depiction of Mansa Musa, who was king of Mali in 1300s and one of the richest kings to ever exist. Now, we're going to watch a video on the transatlantic slave trade.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion, and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians, needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
All right, now we're going to talk about the history of African-American chattel slavery in the United States. First, though, let's define our terms. We have slavery, chattel slavery, and indentured servitude. And what do we mean by those? So slavery is a system where one human may own another as an item of personal property. This practice was used by many cultures throughout history as a source of unpaid labor and as a punishment to criminals or captives of war. Chattel slavery is a type of slavery in which it's the enslaving and owning of human beings and their offspring as property, able to be bought, sold, and forced to work without wages, as distinguished from other systems of forced, unpaid, or low-wage labor, also considered to be slavery, because in chattel slavery, there was no way out. There was no path to freedom, with the exception of the owners releasing them or allowing them to buy their freedom. And then finally, we have indentured servitude. That was the practice of hiring unskilled European laborers to establish a workforce in the colonies. In exchange for passage to America, employees signed a contract to work a fixed number of years and were entitled to housing, clothing, food, pay, and training. They earned their freedom when the contract was completed, and Virginia was the earliest colony to adopt this practice in 1609. So 1619, African-American chattel slavery begins. On August 20th, the privateer the White Lion brings the first known African slaves to American shores in Jamestown, Virginia. These 20 and odd Angolans were kidnapped by the Portuguese and bought by the English colonists. While some Africans did become indentured servants, laws were passed throughout the century barring most Africans from this process. In 1638, the first African slaves arrived in Massachusetts. So in this year, William Pierce of Boston took several Pequot Indians to the West Indies and sold them into slavery. He returned with salt, cotton, tobacco, and African slaves. The English had been exchanging goods for slaves in Africa and the Caribbean since the mid-1500s in the practice that came to be known as the triangular trade, but this transaction is the first recorded instance of slave importation into Massachusetts. What did slavery affect? Slavery affected all aspects of life for the slaves. Throughout the 1600s, colonial laws took different approaches to deny rights to slaves. With very few exceptions, slaves generally couldn't own land, they couldn't vote, they couldn't bear arms, they couldn't gather in groups, even for funerals. They couldn't be tried in court, they couldn't make legal decisions about their families. They were encouraged to practice Christianity, but being Christian didn't change their status. In fact, major life events like baptism and marriage required the owner's approval. These events had no legal or official merit, and laws prevented slaves from using these events to sue or negotiate for their freedom. So laws continue to be passed enslaving Africans, Americans, and further entrenching chattel slavery in the US. So in 1850, we have the Fugitive Slave Act. And that was an act that forced citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. It denied slaves the right to trial by jury and punished those who helped runaway slaves with up to a $1,000 fine and 6 months in jail. So $1,000 then is like over $30,000 now. So it's a very significant fine. There was widespread opposition in the North to such draconian measures, and it led to individual states nullifying part or all of the law. So now we're going to watch another video about the transatlantic slave trade and its effects.
Enslaved Africans have been Europeans purchased slaves along the coast of West and Central Africa. The chained captives were forced onto ships destined to the New World for the long and brutal voyage known as the Middle Passage. Conditions on the ships were indescribably inhumane. The enslaved Africans weren't treated as human beings. They were treated like cargo.
Men and women shackled together, stacked on top of each other. There was a process known as tight packing, where you literally had slave trading scientists who tried to figure out the maximum way to squeeze as many human beings as possible into the holds of these ships.
Incredibly, about 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World between 1525 and 1866. About 15% didn't survive the journey.
4 centuries of trafficking in human beings. And over the course of that time, we're talking about millions of souls involved and millions of souls lost. And yet people endured. And yet they survived.
The overwhelming majority went to destinations other than North America. Of the 12.5 million Africans shipped to the New World as slaves, it's estimated about 450,000 landed on our shores. While a law passed by Congress in 1808 banned the transatlantic slave trade, thousands of slaves are estimated to have been smuggled into our country up to the Civil War. By 1860, the enslaved population in the United States had grown to about 4 million people, a staggering number when you consider that the national population at the time was 31 million. The horrors of slavery in the United States would persist until 1865, when, following the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment was ratified. But the repercussions of institutional slavery are still being felt to this day, as African Americans continue to fight for equal rights and for the right to be heard.
Now we're going to talk about birth of a revolt. So, as you can see from the videos, the slaves pretty early on started fighting and protesting for their freedom. And in fact, America's first African Benevolent Society, a foundation to support African Americans and to free them from slavery, was founded in Rhode Island. So although Rhode Island had abolished African slavery in 1652, the law was not enforced, and by 1750, Rhode Island had more slaves per capita than any other New England state. In fact, until 2020, the full name of Rhode Island was the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, a nod to Rhode Island's slaveholding past. So the fight continues, and it culminates into the 1857 ruling of Dred Scott v. Sanford. Dred Scott was a slave, born in slave territory. His owners took him to free territory and then back to slave territory. He argued in court that when they took him to free territory, he should have been freed. The case made its way to the Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Roger B. Taney wrote that African Americans had no right which white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefits. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise in traffic whenever profit could be made by it. So the ruling in Dred Scott declared that all African Americans in the United States, slave and free, were not and could never become U.S. citizens. So we're going to talk about a union divided. In 1780, Massachusetts puts into effect a new state constitution offering protections and human rights to all state residents. The following year, the Brom and Betts v. Ashley case successfully achieved the freedom of 2 slaves by arguing that the new constitution made slavery illegal. More slaves sued for their freedom, and by 1788, slavery was abolished in Massachusetts. But what happened post-Revolutionary War in the rest of the country? Many northern states began abolishing slavery, but as the United States grew in size, pro and anti-slavery factions argued over whether slavery should be permitted in the new states. What happens when you can't come to an agreement? You compromise. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise added Missouri as a slave state in return for Maine joining as a free state and banning slavery north of the 3630 parallel. In fact, the Missouri Compromise is how Oklahoma got its panhandle. When Texas joined the Union as a state, it had to cede that part of its territory that was north of the 3630 parallel. Then the Compromise of 1850 banned slavery in DC and California in return for approving the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and giving popular sovereignty, the right of citizens to vote on slavery, in Utah and New Mexico. So they knew it looked bad that the nation's capital, this home of democracy, had slaves, but it was too profitable to give up. So then we have the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that allowed popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska, even though they were north of the 3630 parallel. So that basically nullifies the Missouri Compromise. Finally, Dred Scott v. Sanford, the decision of 1857 that declared even free Blacks were not citizens of the United States, and that the federal government could not regulate slavery in any state or territory, so nullifying all previous federal laws that banned slavery in certain states. So what happens when you can't come to a compromise? You have a war. We're going to watch now a video about the Civil War and emancipation.
On that island sits Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, a single mortar shell shattered the pre-dawn sky, and the United States, just 85 years old, erupted into all-out civil war. Initially, for President Abraham Lincoln, the war was about a single overriding goal: saving the Union from the forces of secession in the American South, forces that were threatening to tear the Republic apart.
There was a ditty that people used to sing around Union recruiting that I think sums up what Lincoln's original orientation was. It went something like, I stand for the Union, all its foes I abhor. I ain't for the N-word, but I am for the war.
Soon after the war began, its focus began to change when enslaved African Americans, forced to work in the Confederacy's defense, escaped behind Union lines.
Escaped slaves who run away to Union lines are called contraband. And what Union policymakers, including Lincoln, begin to recognize is this creates a welcome disruption among the Southern slaveholders. This deprives them of their property, it shuts down their plantations, and it makes their war effort more difficult.
The swelling numbers of contraband pushed President Lincoln to see that the Civil War was actually about abolishing the institution of slavery, ultimately leading him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
In many ways, the Emancipation Proclamation is, first and foremost, a military policy. It's not clear the Union is winning the war before the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation also gives these escaped slaves the opportunity to serve in the Union Army. This is crucial to the Union's success in the war effort.
With the freedom of their people at stake, almost 200,000 black men enlisted in the Union Army and Navy, playing a pivotal role in bringing victory to the North.
The key element that changed the outcome of this war in terms of who won it and in terms of what it was about were the slaves themselves. Their determination that this war was going to be about the end of slavery. Masses of self-liberated slaves became the wave that the Union would ultimately ride to victory.
All right, so we have the war, and now we're going to talk about tools of violence. Slavery ends, and the Southerners are not happy about it. And there are many ways that they use to keep this newly freed slaves in line. So first, we have a video that we're going to watch on lynching. Please be aware that this video is very, very graphic, and viewer discretion is advised.
The Jim Crow era was marked by a reign of domestic terror known as lynching, a grotesque form of mob rule without judge or jury. The first reported lynching is said to have occurred in Madison, Mississippi in 1835. And what followed were decades of hangings, used as a way to terrorize black people.
People who carried out these lynchings could have buried the bodies in the ground, but hanging was preferred because it lifted these bodies up to terrorize and taunt communities of color.
Some people even brought children and picnic baskets to these brutal murders. Others took photographs of the victims, using them to produce lynching postcards. With law enforcement so often negligent in the face of lynch mobs, it took a revolution in public opinion to bring an end to lynchings as a public spectacle. Few did more to end lynching than journalist Ida B. Wells. Wells's reporting documented hundreds of lynchings and countered the belief that the hangings were justifiable punishment for brutal acts of criminality. Building on Wells's research and writings, the NAACP made the fight to end lynching core to its mission.
They would hang a black flag saying a man was lynched today. It was very successful in mobilizing African Americans and their allies.
Though lynchings decreased in most parts of the country, they remained a vicious practice in the South. Notably, the brutal murder in 1955 of 14-year-old Emmett Till. Till was kidnapped and murdered by two neighborhood white men after he was accused of whistling at a white woman in their store. His mother's insistence on an opened casket and press photos of his mutilated body catalyzed the civil rights movement. Till's accuser would recant her story more than 60 years later. The last documented lynching in the United States took place 26 years after Emmett Till was murdered. In 1981, Michael Donald was attacked at random by two members of the Ku Klux Klan. He was beaten, then strangled, and hanged. Donald's mother filed a case against the Klan and won. An all-white jury awarded her $7 million. The case also set a legal precedent that hate groups are responsible for the action of their members. It wouldn't be until 2018 that the United States Senate passed a bill that would classify the act of lynching as a hate crime.
After 100 years and more than 200 failed attempts in the United States Congress, the United States Senate finally spoke the truth about lynching.
The bill serves as a symbolic apology for Congress's failure to act as thousands of African Americans were brutally murdered.
All right. Lynching wasn't the only way that African Americans were tormented. We are also going to talk about cross-burning. So cross-burning has been used as a form of intimidation against not just African Americans, but also Jewish people, and has been defended in the courts as a First Amendment right. The practice itself dates back to 14th century Scotland, where tribes burned crosses as signaling devices. The modern use of cross-burning is directly linked to a revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 20th century. An earlier version of the Klan, which was created by former Confederate officers to impede Reconstruction in the South and to terrorize newly freed slaves, did not burn crosses. You'll see we have two photos. In this January 30th, 1939 photo, members of the Ku Klux Klan are wearing white hoods and robes, watch a burning cross in Tampa, Florida. And in this April 23rd, 2016 photo, members of the Ku Klux Klan participate in cross burnings after a white pride rally in rural Paulding County near Cedartown, Georgia. In 2016, Ku Klux Klan leaders said they felt that U.S. politics were going their way as a nationalist us against them mentality deepened across the nation. We talked about lynching. So Reggie Jackson has a lesson on lynching and insensitivity of powerful men who misuse the word. I have heard people too often use the term lynching to describe something they consider to be a horrible injustice done to them. As is usually the case, the people who do so are clueless about the history of lynching, or they would never so casually use this word. For example, so someday, if a Democrat becomes president and the Republicans win the House, even by a tiny margin, they can impeach the president without due process or fairness or any legal rights. All Republicans must remember what they are witnessing here, a lynching, but we will win. But as you see in these photos, that is not a lynching. A lynching is a brutal murder and a body left as a reminder to keep people in line, as a reminder of what can happen to them at any time. We're going to talk about Emmett Till. So Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American who was lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after being accused of offending a white woman in her family's grocery store. So Emmett Till was originally from Chicago, and his mother had sent him to visit her family down south for the summer. The brutality of his murder and the fact that his killers were acquitted drew attention to the long history of violent persecution of African Americans in the United States. So Emmett Till posthumously becomes an icon of the civil rights movement. And in fact, the U.S. Senate just voted to posthumously award him and his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, with the Congressional Gold Medal in January 2022. And Emmett Till was important because since 1900, the House and Senate have repeatedly failed to pass an anti-lynching bill. The bill, which called the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, was introduced by Representative Bobby Rush, a Democrat from Illinois. The Senate bill, which passed unanimously last year, was introduced by then Senator Kamala Harris of California, Cory Booker, Democrat of New Jersey, and Tim Scott, Republican of South Carolina. The act finally passed in February 2020. Now we're going to watch a brief video on Emmett Till. Once again, please be advised that you are about to see graphic images.
At a church on the south side of Chicago, Emmett Till's mutilated body would be on display. for all to see.
It was on a Sunday afternoon. I won't ever forget, it was a Sunday afternoon. The church was very calm, the line was very orderly. I thought that pretty soon the crowd would die down. It looked like all of Chicago was there.
Well, they brought the children with them because Emmett was 14 years old, and they wanted the younger kids to see what happened to Emmett. They were mad, they were angry.
And as we were led into the church, my girlfriends and myself, we walked up to the casket, and it was covered with glass. And we all looked down. This was our friend laying, looking like a monster. They said that about 1 in every 5 had to be assisted out of the building. They would just go into a faint.
I think Black people's reaction was so visceral. Everybody knew we were under attack. And that attack was symbolized by the attack on a 14-year-old boy.
Now we're going to talk about sundown towns. What are they? Sundown towns, also known as sunset towns, gray towns, or sundowner towns, are all white municipalities or neighborhoods in the United States that practice a form of racial segregation by excluding non-whites via some combination of discriminatory local laws, intimidation, and violence. So why were they called sundown towns? Because they wanted them out of town by sunset. Why? Because they needed African Americans to come in and work and perform whatever labor tasks they had, but they did not want them living there, and they made sure they knew it. Sundown towns were especially a danger for African Americans as they traveled. And so in 1936, an African American mailman in New York City named Victor Hugo Green created the Negro Motorist Green Book, sometimes just called the Green Book. It was a traveler's guide, an annual traveler's guide for African American motorists that told them where it was safe to stop, where it was safe to get gas, where it was safe to rest, where it was safe to use the bathroom, where it was safe to eat, where it was safe to sleep. All of these things they wouldn't know and could cause real problems if they stopped somewhere that was unsafe. So let's talk about the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. So the KKK was founded in 1865. And it extended into almost every Southern state by 1870 and became a vehicle for white Southern resistance to the Republican Party's Reconstruction era policies aimed at establishing political and economic equality for Black Americans. So its members basically waged an underground terrorist campaign of intimidation and violence directed at both white and Black Republican leaders. Though Congress passed legislation designed to curb Klan terrorism, the organism saw its primary goal, the reestablishment of white supremacy, fulfilled through Democratic victories in state legislatures across the South in the 1870s. Because even though they passed legislation, there were a lot of Klan sympathizers who, while they couldn't outwardly support them, did in secret. After a period of decline, white Protestant nativist groups revived the Klan in the early 20th century, burning crosses and staging rallies, parades, and marches denouncing immigrants, Catholics, Jews, African Americans, and organized labor. Basically, anybody not white and Protestant. The civil rights movement of the 1960s also saw a surge of Ku Klux Klan activity, including bombings of Black schools and churches and violence against Black and white activists in the South. So the Klan is one of those things that rises in times of social progress and uncertainty. So the Klan, as they were trying to move forward with civil rights for the former slaves in the 1860s and 70s, the Klan is very popular. Once Reconstruction ends, the Klan dies down. Then we have the Great Migration of the 19-teens and 1920s, coupled with the economic uncertainties and the Spanish influenza pandemic. Klan rises up again. Those things change. Klan dies down. Then we have civil rights. Membership in the Klan increases. Once civil rights is over, Klan dies down. So what are these things all? Why are we showing you this? Because these things that happened in the past have an effect on us in the present. So in 2015, there was a shooting at Mother Emanuel Methodist at the Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. It was called Mother Emanuel, and it is the oldest AME church in the South, and it has a history of working for African American liberation. So it was very symbolic that that is the church he chose to commit his act of terror. Now, let's talk about everyone's favorite subject, the Confederate flag. First, the Civil War started because of the uncompromising differences between the free and slave states over the power of the national government to prohibit slavery in the territories that had not yet become states. The Civil War started at Fort Sumter in Charleston Bay, South Carolina on April 12, 1861. As you saw in a Union divided, the North and the South, the anti and pro-slavery factions kept trying to compromise, but eventually the compromises failed. We went to war. So what is this flag actually? We're going to have us a little history lesson. So there have been many different flags of the Confederacy, many for the actual Confederacy itself, many for the various armies of the Confederacy, including individual regiments had their own flag. So there was a national flag of the Confederate States of America and States of America with all the white space. Then there was the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. Then there was the battle flag of the Army of Tennessee. So neither of those flags, that some people like to call the stars and bars, are the actual national flag for the Confederate States of America. But they all represent acts of sedition and treason against the United States of America. And so, like we said, there's been many, many versions of the flag. And so the version that most people use is Robert E. Lee's battle flag that was later adopted as the naval jack. And many people argue that it was used because this flag was so niche, and it only really began to become popular in the 1940s and 50s as African Americans started fighting for civil rights. So in short, no, this flag is not honoring your veteran ancestors. They probably didn't use it. And yes, it's racist. Now, let's look at, what do you see? All right, let's talk Reconstruction. So what happens after the Civil War? We have, while the Ku Klux Klan and all of that is organizing, we have Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was the 12-year period immediately following the Civil War, where the United States attempted to address the political, social, and economic inequities of slavery. So in the second half of the 1860s, Congress passed a series of acts to address this inequality, as well as set parameters for the former Confederate states to be readmitted to the Union. So they have the question of what to do with these, at that point, I believe, 4 million former slaves. Also, how do we that committed treason against us back into the Union? So we start with the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and that declared all people born in the United States, with the exception of Native Americans, as citizens of the United States, with full and equal benefits of all laws and proceedings for the security of person and property. So President Andrew Johnson initially vetoed the bill, but he was overridden 122-41 in the House of Representatives, and this bill was a guideline for the 14th and 15th Amendments. So first, we're going to start with our 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment is 1865. It's very clear. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. The amendment was passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865, and ratified by the required 27 of then 36 states on December 6, 1865, and proclaimed on December 18th. Very short, sweet, and to the point. Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, and Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So hold on to that part about punishment for a crime, because we're going to come back to that later. What is the 14th Amendment? I like to call this one our housekeeping amendment because there's a lot of things that it needs to address. So first, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Why is this important? Remember, we had Dred Scott that basically stripped citizenship from African Americans in the US, so this has to restore it, or has to actually give it to them. So then section 2, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. But when the right to vote in the election for the choice of electors for president and vice president of the United States, representatives in Congress, the executive and judicial officers of each state, or members of the legislature thereof, is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state, being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged, except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. What is this saying? So we didn't talk about this, but when the United States is becoming a nation, we have to decide what to do about the slaves in terms of representation in the House of Representatives. And they come up with the 3/5 compromise. So slaves aren't citizens, slaves can't vote, but slaves count as 3/5 of a person in terms of representation, giving slave holding states an unfair advantage, basically. Section 2 addresses that issue. And it also addresses what to do with people who can't vote for whatever legal reason. So then section 3 basically says no person shall be a senator or representative of Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. What is that talking about? The former Confederacy, the people who held high positions in the Confederacy, the people who seceded from the Union, they cannot be elected to Congress. Then Section 4 talks about the validity of public debt to the United States, and Section 5 gives Congress the power to enforce all of the above. Now, we have our 15th Amendment. Very simple, 1870 says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So check the date, 1870. We're going to come back to that later. Finally, we have the Freedmen's Bureau. So established in 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau provided food, housing, medical aid, schooling, and legal assistance to millions of former slaves and poor whites in the former Confederacy. The Freedmen's Bureau was the federal government's attempt to address all of the issues that the newly freed slaves and poor white Southerners faced during the Reconstruction period. So it was deeply unpopular. And the Freedmen's Bureau faced resistance from many, including white Southerners and then President Andrew Johnson. It was underfunded, it had a huge mandate and not enough manpower, but it was able to establish a lasting legacy in the historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, that it left behind, such as Howard, Fisk, and Hampton University. Now, we're going to watch a brief video about the vote.
Most of us know our country fought a civil war in the 1860s, but less is known about what came afterward, the chaotic, exhilarating, and ultimately devastating period known as Reconstruction. It was a moment of profound change with promises of citizenship and equal rights for all. One of the greatest achievements of Reconstruction was granting Black men the right to vote. In 1867 alone, over 80% of all the Black men in the former Confederate states registered to vote. 3 years later, Hiram Revels was elected the first Black man to serve in the United States Senate, and Joseph Rainey became the first Black United States Congressman. Their election paved the way for more than 2,000 Black office holders who served at every level of government during Reconstruction.
There are not many moments in recorded human history where a group that was so subordinated would, within the space of a decade, actually be integrated into the highest echelons of political society.
But the momentum wouldn't last. Black men's access to the ballot box, along with other key rights gained during Reconstruction, were rolled back systematically throughout the South. In 1875, near the end of Reconstruction, the 44th Congress included 7 Black House members and a United States Senator. By 1900, only one remained, Congressman George Henry White of North Carolina.
By the time George H. White leaves office in 1901, he literally turns the light off on national Black political leadership. No one will come behind him for an entire generation.
One of the cruel ironies of Reconstruction is that Black people could claim certain rights in the 1870s that they would have to fight to reclaim in the 1960s. A sobering reminder that achievements thought permanent can be overturned and rights can never be taken for granted.
Now we're going to talk about what came after Reconstruction, the period of time known as Jim Crow. So let's get started with Jim Crow. So Jim Crow was a minstrel character created by Thomas D. Rice, a white actor in the 1830s. The fictional Jim Crow was a caricature, a clumsy, dim-witted, lazy slave. As the Jim Crow character gained popularity, it took on a second meaning as a derogatory term for African Americans. So let's talk about the types of segregation under Jim Crow. First, we have de jure segregation. What does this mean? De jure segregation is the legally allowed or enforced separation of groups of people. The Latin phrase de jure literally means according to the law. The Jim Crow laws in the United States from the late 1800s into the 1960s and the South African apartheid laws that separated Black people from white people from 1948 to 1990 are examples of de jure segregation. While typically associated with race, de jure segregation has existed and still exists today in other areas such as gender and age. Now we have de facto segregation. So de facto segregation describes the social, economic, and racial segregation practiced in many communities during the Jim Crow era. So de facto segregation was not backed by laws. Nevertheless, it affected where African Americans lived, worked, and attended school, among other issues. So there would be, let's say that you wanted to move into a town. There's no law saying you can't, they just won't sell you a house. That's de facto segregation. What did Jim Crow affect? Like slavery, it affected every aspect of life for African Americans in the United States. It affected interracial marriage. So there were anti-miscegenation laws or miscegenation laws. These are laws that enforce racial segregation at the level of marriage and intimate relationships by criminalizing interracial marriage and sometimes also sex between members of different races. It took until 1967 with the Loving versus Virginia case for anti-miscegenation laws to be overturned. This case involved Mildred Loving, a woman of color, and her white husband, Richard Loving, who in 1958 were sentenced to a year in prison for marrying each other in Washington, D.C. Their marriage violated Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which criminalized interracial marriage. The Lovings appealed their conviction to the Supreme Court of Virginia, which upheld it. They then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 1967 agreed that interracial marriage bans violated the equal protection and due process clauses of the 14th Amendment. The Jim Crow era is marked by violence. There are many, many, many episodes of racial violence that happened in the United States during that time. So we have the Rosewood Massacre that happened in Florida in 1923, and it was a racially motivated massacre of Black people and a destruction of a Black town that took place during the first week of January 1923 in rural Levy County, Florida. At least 6 Black people and 2 white people were killed, though witness accounts suggested a higher death toll of 27 to 150. And in fact, there was a movie made in the late 90s called Rosewood about this massacre. We have Black Wall Street Massacre that happened in Tulsa in 1921. So the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma was the epicenter of African-American business and prosperity in the area. It was called Black Wall Street because there were so many African-American owned businesses. Greenwood was founded by an African-American businessman to be a safe haven for the community. By 1921, Greenwood was home to about 10,000 African-American residents. It was the site of a race riot where they, in fact, I believe, dropped bombs on the area and pretty much totally leveled it. And we're going to talk about Red Summer. So Red Summer is a period in 1919 during which white supremacist terrorism and racial riots took place in dozens of cities across the United States, as mainly returning white soldiers sought to put African-American veterans in their place and maintain the supremacy of Jim Crow. So many African-American soldiers returned from World War I, ready to fight for the freedoms denied to them by segregation. Remember, they're fighting for the freedom of Europeans, and they come home to be second-class citizens. So we have that coupled with the Great Migration, and that's a massive relocation of African Americans from the agricultural South to the industrial North, and the U.S. was a hotbed of racial tension in the as the African American population in northern cities such as Chicago and Philadelphia caused anxieties among white residents because they were afraid of losing their jobs and their place in society. If you add into that the fact that they are in the middle of a pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, you have a very, very potent and violent mix. Hundreds died, thousands were injured, and tens of thousands were left homeless. We're going to watch a video on Red Summer. Once again, please be advised that the images you are about to see are very graphic and may be disturbing.
Reeling from the unprecedented devastation of a global pandemic, nurturing wounds from a brutal military victory abroad, struggling to accommodate demobilized soldiers into a slumping economy fraught with heated competition for jobs, Jim Crow's separate but equal policies endorsed by the President of the United States himself, now firmly in place as the law of the land, white supremacists targeted terrorist attacks on an all-too-familiar scapegoat. In another epidemic, Black citizens found themselves on the lethal end of an outbreak of racial violence in 1919, so horrific that the civil rights leader James Weldon Johnson called it the Red Summer. The events unfolding across the United States today, in the wake of the brutal murder of George Floyd, are an eerie repetition of events that marred the history of race relations in this country almost exactly a century ago. African American soldiers returned from noble service in Europe during World War I, fully expecting that their sacrifices to their country would at long last entitle them to their full rights as equal citizens. Instead, the uniforms they wore literally became targets on their backs.
W.E.B. Du Bois famously said that we return from fighting, we return fighting. We've saved democracy overseas and we're going to save it in the United States. That didn't happen.
Between April and November of 1919, with the country devastated by an influenza pandemic known as the Spanish flu, racial unrest rolled through the South, the North, and the Midwest, where the Great Migration was just unfolding in its earliest years.
The migration, of course, had transformed large parts of the North and the West. In 1915, there were hardly a few Black people in Chicago. By 1919, 1.2 million people have spread themselves across the map.
This demographic transformation of the color of the urban North, coupled with the stresses of a post-war economic downturn, combined to create the volatile conditions under which African American workers conveniently became magnets for white resentment and fear.
The pushback was fierce. Chicago was wrecked by fights along a dividing artery between one population and the other. Hundreds of people are dead. Cities are smoldering.
It was one of the most vicious, virulent, and violent race riots in our nation's history.
Small towns were also shaken by race-fueled violence. In Elaine, Arkansas, for example, white vigilantes joined plantation owners, sheriffs, deputies, and even state officials to battle what they called an uprising. Hundreds of black sharecroppers were murdered merely for trying to form a union. Yet in the aftermath, a grand jury callously indicted more than 100 black women and men for their so-called crimes. Of course, racial violence was anything but new in the America of that time. Still, amid the fallout from the Great War, the rising generation, calling themselves New Negroes, was not about to fold their tents. Instead, Red Summer saw black Americans not only picking up arms to defend themselves, but also utilizing political organizations like the NAACP to challenge the violence in Congress, in the courts, in the media, and on the streets. In If We Must Die, the poet Claude McKay captured the tenor of the times in his immortal call for defiance in the face of tyranny and terror. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back.
All right, so let's talk voting rights. Remember how the 15th Amendment in 1870 gives African American men the right to vote? Well, there are ways around that. We'll start with literacy tests. So literacy tests were used to keep people of color and sometimes poor whites from voting. And they were administered at the discretion of the officials in charge of voter registration. So if the official wanted a person to pass, he could ask the easiest question on the test. For example, who is the president of the United States? Poll taxes. Poll taxes were high fees charged to prospective voters that often prevented African Americans from voting. In southern states, people had to pay a tax to vote. The taxes were about $25 to $50 in today's money, but that was a lot of money for people back then because many people had extremely low incomes and could not afford this tax. And this poll tax applied to all people who wanted to vote, Black and white. But as always, there are loopholes. There were ways for whites to get around poll taxes, including grandfather clauses. Laws that stated that a white male voter whose father or grandfather voted for us before a specific date, usually 1866 or 1867, could vote without paying the tax. Why 1866 or 1867? Because 1870, the 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote. And also, this is where our phrase grandfather clause, grandfathered in comes from. It comes from the laws of the poll taxes and the ways in which that white Americans were able to avoid having to pay them. Once again, Jim Crow affects every aspect of African American life in this country. So we have separate beaches and pools, and African Americans still have the lowest rates of swimming ability in the US to this day. In fact, they were very virulent about African Americans and their access to pools. And in fact, some communities, instead of integrating or allowing African Americans to have access to the pools, would just fill them with concrete. We have separate restaurants, lunch counters, and stores. So we had the Woolworth lunch counter sit-ins. And so 4 African-American college students sat down at a lunch counter and refused service. They remained in their seats. And that sparked an important protest practice of the civil rights movement, the sit-in, where they would go, they knew they were going to be refused service, but they stayed to make a point. There's separate bathroom facilities. So for colored only bathrooms and water fountains. Schools. So public and private schools, separate but equal. Prior to 1954, many schools in the United States were segregated. But In its ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, the Supreme Court unanimously decided that separate but equal, a phrase that comes from the 1896 Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, is inherently unequal. As cities and states moved to integrate schools, there was a rise in private and religious schools in the mid-20th century to maintain educational segregation. So of course, there were the historically Black colleges and universities that were created under the Freedmans Bureau, and they served to kind of fill in the gap for African Americans for their higher education needs, and also sometimes for like secondary education. Transportation. So we have segregated buses. So remember, we have segregated trains and other transportation that required African Americans to sit in the back of the bus or in separate train cars. The legality of segregated transportation was upheld in the 1896 ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson and did not end until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As I said, Plessy v. Ferguson is where we get the phrase separate but equal. Even though trains were segregated, many African American men worked as Pullman porters. These were servants that worked on Pullman train cars and the sleeper cars, handling baggage, shining shoes, setting up berths, and providing full service amenities to customers. Though the porters were underpaid and overworked, by the early 1900s, Pullman was the largest employer of African American men. Why? Because they were underpaid and overworked. So they could pay them lower wages than they paid white porters, and they worked for tips. And that's a whole other conversation that we'll have one day about tipping culture in the US. In 1925, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union was created by A. Philip Randolph, who we're going to talk about later, to organize the Pullman porters who were excluded from regular train unions. Now, we're going to watch a brief video about the Jim Crow minstrel character. Please note that everyone in that video was a white actor in blackface. And what is blackface? Putting black paint, coal suit, or whatever to darken the skin, and in their hair too. And sometimes they'd wear gloves so you couldn't tell, but everyone in there was wearing blackface.
So we're going to stop right here, and this is the first part of the museum. You can take a break and then come back and watch the second half, but we're going to stop the video right now, and then we are going to welcome you back, okay?